So we have Connor Floyd back with us again today on short notice. Thank you, Connor, for rejoining us after being with us yesterday from the Agency of Education. And with him is Rosie Kruger, who we've met previously, also from the agency. Thank you both, and good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
So we had a whole lot of folks yesterday in what turned out to be too little time, although it seemed like more than enough time, I think, when we scheduled it for Farm to School Day. And I just wanted to have Connor back in to try and dig a little bit deeper into the local purchasing incentive, how that works, what the mechanics are, what the opportunities might be there to tweak it. It's a fairly new program. It's only been in place for a couple of years, I think, and you can confirm that. And then, Rosie, I don't know if you wanted to speak on that or if you had, I know that we're hoping to have you or someone in to hear from the agency on the language in the Universal School Meals Bill. And
yeah, so
really happy to hear from you.
I'm here because it sounded like yesterday and in some of your other testimony that you've been hearing that you had some kind of general questions about meal programs, thinking about things that might make sense with universal meals or might make sense as standalone bills. And so I'm just here if you end up having any questions in your discussion with Connor that are more general child nutrition programs questions rather than just focused on the local foods incentive, I'm here to answer those and provide any support there. And I can answer a couple of questions that I've heard you all kind of asking over the last week or so that weren't directly related to universal meals. So happy to do that as well.
Okay, great, thank you. Connor, and I apologize, I'm not sure whether we ended up sort of cutting you off yesterday before you had a chance to fully cover what you wanted to cover, or if you, and if so, you can feel free to just jump right back in. And if not, we'll see what questions we have.
For the record, Connor Floyd, Grant Program Manager with the Child Nutrition Program team at the Agency of Education. And I think really, I covered a very quick snapshot of the program yesterday, but there's a lot more nuance and detail there. And so I'm happy to kind of dig into whatever aspects folks are interested in. If you think you need more context before you can ask those questions, I'm happy to kind of spitball, but I'm also happy to take your lead. I will say, so this is the second year of the grant program, so it is still very new. And with that, as we're thinking about things that we want to tweak or change, I'm always looking to improve the program. I'm always looking to streamline it, but I also want to caution changing things too much, right? Because it does take so long for programs to make these changes, to adapt to the new rules. And so, if we're making massive changes right off the bat, it's just that it lengthens the time that it will take schools to adopt and become familiar with what we're asking for. And I've already seen, I'm finishing up audits of this year's subsequent year applications right now. As always, despite best efforts at communication, there are things that just fall through the cracks sometimes with some applicants. And so it's a constant learning process there.
Great. So the program, you just reminded us that this is the second school year that it's been in effect. So the legislature 2 years ago then would have passed legislation that launched it, or was it earlier? You needed time to get ready.
The legislation was Act 67, which I believe was enacted September of 2021, or right around then, I believe.
July 1st of 2021.
July 1st, 2021. Thanks, Rosie.
Okay, so it went into effect July 1st of 2021, and then immediately, essentially, districts able to apply or.
Correct. Well, that's right. July 1st, I was hired in September, and then we were collecting applications in December. And so it was a pretty quick turnaround time for me to get onboarded and familiarize myself with the program and then start putting out guidance. And so we were, behind what would be ideal there, just because of the nature of that timeline. But yes, we had folks applying. We had school food authorities applying in December of 2021 for their first baseline year grants.
So they were districts that applied and were accepted, which sounds like maybe all of them were, if they met.
For the baseline year, yes.
Yeah. So for that baseline year, then that was the school year they were in at the time. It was the 21-22 school year, and they received funding for that was the baseline year.
Correct. Well, so yeah, thinking about the timeline there. So let's use this example of December 2021. School food authorities applied for a baseline year. In that application, they had to lay out their local purchasing plan. They had to identify a local foods coordinator who would essentially be the point person for the grant moving forward. They needed to identify what tracking method that they would use. We offered 2 templates, and we just wanted to collect some information about which way folks were going. And then in addition to that, in the financial report, which is a separate collection that we require of all school food authorities, they had to provide an estimate of their local purchasing for the previous school year, right? So this was December 2021. We were asking for data from the 2020-2021 school year. And so the grant's always looking back at the previous year. And so then those same schools, some of those same school food authorities were the ones that applied for a subsequent year grant in December 2022, this past December. And in that, they were reporting their purchasing numbers from the 21-22 school year. And so that's where we kind of get this a little bit of a weird gap period where the school year started officially on July 1st, 2021. If they intended to apply for a subsequent year grant in December of 2022, they already had to start tracking, right? So they should have been tracking their local purchases and trying to increase local purchasing in July 1st, even though they weren't going to actually apply for their baseline year grant until December of 2021. And so it's a little bit of a convoluted timeline. I still find myself tripping up over those dates sometimes when trying to communicate to schools, but we get around it. Yeah.
Representative Rice.
Yeah, Connor, 2 sort of related questions. One, just wonder if you could share any feedback that you've gotten on the 15, 20, 25 sort of thresholds. Are they the right levels? Are the dollars coming in effective? Are they helping the schools actually move forward with increasing purchasing? And then also yesterday, in Jim Birmingham's testimony, we heard this idea from him that perhaps if there are funds left over from the appropriation for the grants, that those would be used to provide partial grants to districts that are coming close to meeting that 15% threshold but haven't quite gotten there, and that would be a way to encourage schools to take up this process, even if they're not quite confident that they're going to reach that 15%. So just wondering if you could share any feedback you might have on that too.
Yeah, thank you. Both good questions. Thinking about, is 15% the right base threshold? That's a question I had. Honestly, before this year's applications, I was worried that 15% was too high. But we had 6 schools apply and report percentages that were 15% or higher. In the audit process, we found that one just interpreted the rules incorrectly, and so they were including milk, which shouldn't have been included. So they're not going to actually hit that threshold. But we still have 5 that we believe are likely to hit that 15%. I think that's a reasonable, for the first year, to have 5 school food authorities within that, with some at the 27% being the highest, showing that it's not only possible to hit 15%, but if you're really dedicated to this and being strategic with your purchasing, you can go far beyond 15. My sense is that 15, 20, and 25 at this time is a good threshold. If we become wildly successful and we're seeing a bunch of schools in like the 30% range, it'd be exciting to have that conversation later on about, do we need to continue this incentive in that kind of best case scenario? But I do think that this is the right amount, because for most school food authorities, this is going to take some time to shift purchasing, which is the intention, right, of this incentive. And so as the years go on, I expect to see more and more schools coming on board. So kind of long answer to yes, I think 15% does feel like the right threshold. Jim's suggestion about what to do with those kind of unused funds that have been appropriated, I think that's a really interesting idea. I think that it makes sense in terms of providing a smaller incentive, but still an incentive for those school food authorities that maybe feel very daunted by the process, and they're like only at 5%. So what's even the point? I think that might be a light carrot, and we would, if we chose to do that, we would always communicate that is not guaranteed funding. Only comes after all the other awards are provided and would likely be prorated at that point. I think the one consideration that comes to mind for me is just around program integrity. And with the applications that do hit 15%, we've got a pretty, I think a fairly in-depth review process to ensure that the money we're providing are to schools that are buying that Vermont local product. It would just in practice of the workflow of when applications come in, when we need to grant funds, that review probably wouldn't exist for those schools that didn't hit that percentage. Presumably, if you're reporting numbers that don't hit 15%, you're not fudging your numbers. You wouldn't fudge your numbers and then still not be successful. But that's just one thing that I would encourage you to think about. And if that's not a concern, or it isn't as large of a concern, I think that's totally fine.
Connor, you told us yesterday, but how many schools had originally applied the first year?
23 applied for the baseline year in the first year of the program, and then we had 8 additional baseline applicants this year.
And the group of 20 some then that applied the first year were all eligible, are eligible this year if they hit that 15%.
Correct.
You have enough data at this point to know how many will, or is that jury still out there?
We're just wrapping. So there's one applicant that we're just wrapping up their review of their information and just looking for some more product documentation. The rest are good. So we know that one of those 6 that reported 15% or higher is not going to be successful just because of those reporting inconsistencies. We have 4 that have, passed the review, really great record keeping, had all the product documentation that we were looking for. And then there's 1 that we're just doing a little bit more follow-up with.
Yeah, I don't want to be the only one asking questions, but I'll keep going. Representative Cole.
You think you're going to
No.
Well, throughout this bill, I've been, definitely trying to eye places that speak to the content of what is actually put on the plate of these kiddos. And so one of the few places was on page 8 of the bill on line 17, which says, for school districts collaborating with the school's Wellness Community Advisory Council as established under subsection 136E of this title in planning school meals. And so it seems like this Community Advisory Council, as established by this subsection of this bill, they seem to have a good amount of power here in meal planning. And so I'm wondering, I wasn't able to find that online, what subsection or what the language was in that particular piece there. So I'm curious if you could speak to that. What is the Community Advisory Council, the school's Wellness Community Advisory Council?
Thank you, Rosie.
So I can jump in on that one. For the record, Rosie Kruger, I'm the State Director of Child Nutrition Programs at the Agency of Education. So there's actually a USDA requirement that all school food authorities have a wellness policy, and that they have a committee who reviews that policy on a triennial basis. And so that's a USDA level requirement, and there's some requirements about what's in that wellness policy. And then we have a state requirement that I'm not as up to speed on, but I think you all did a bunch of work on this last year around wellness committees and what all would be included in the wellness committee's oversight. And I think there was a lot of work last year to try and make sure, and there has been some work with the folks that were designated to be kind of working on this at a state level by the legislation that you all had previously done, to make sure that the state and federal requirements play well together, and that that it can be one advisory committee that is working on all of this to meet those USDA requirements, and then also meet those other wellness goals that the state has. And so that's what's being referred to there. And if you are interested more in the work generally of what those wellness committees do, there are other folks at the agency who have been working more closely on that, and we can direct you to those folks. But that's why there's that reference there. So those are wellness committees that include advising on the meal program, but also on things like nutrition education and physical activity and all kinds of other stuff.
And just to follow up, just to provide, a concrete example, typically what sort of roles do these people have? Like, who comprises this committee in terms of titles?
So there are some USDA requirements about who all is included. And I don't know that I have them off the top of my head, but usually we would see a school nurse. If you have nutrition educators, you'd see them included. I think there has to be a student, and there's usually a parent and some other administrators included.
So the USDA website is where I could find more information on that.
Yeah, there's a nice USDA one-pager on what has to be included in the wellness policy. And so I will try to pull that up for you. And then again, like I mentioned, we have some additional state requirements on top of that.
Thank you.
And then the state has a really nice template wellness policy that's in the process of being updated, but that template wellness policy includes all the USDA requirements, as well as some best practices recommended by AOE in combination with the health department and the Agency of Agriculture.
Representative O'Brien.
I don't know if this is for Rosie or Connor, but I'm just trying to understand how an SU comes up with what they charge for lunches. Like we heard yesterday that the federal government's going to reimburse you at a set level for free and reduced, but different SUs actually have different prices, say, for what they're charging for their lunches. And I want to go towards where these SUs and the nutritional directors run into ceilings, and they're sort of forced to use USDA. And this at some point is going to impact how much local food we can buy, because unless you have supplemental revenue that you're putting into your lunches, you're just going to max out at some point. And that's, I can see that's what the local food initiative is helping a little bit there, but we can't get to 50% Vermont foods at the current level because the USDA's commodities are too tempting.
So I think you've got two different questions going there, and I can answer both of them. So the first question is, how do schools set the meal price? And that is actually regulated by USDA, and that's regulated at a minimum. So in a pricing program, when we're not doing universal meals, when we're charging some students for meals, USDA requires that schools set a price that is at least as high as the difference between the free reimbursement rate and the paid reimbursement rate. So what you are doing now with the universal meal supplement, that number is what schools are required to set their rate at a minimum. They can set it higher than that. And that's because of the requirement called paid lunch equity. And the requirement is there so that you don't have a situation where the federal reimbursement for the free and reduced price meals is subsidizing the meals that are served to paid students. So USDA sets that minimum, but they also say that a school can only be required to increase their prices by 10 cents per year. So we have situations where a school may have had a really low lunch price initially. We came in and did the PLE calculation and found that they needed to increase it, but we can't require them to suddenly increase it by $1.50 because that would be such a jarring and sudden increase that you may really impact those paid households and they may stop participating. So USDA every year has a target lunch price, which is based on that difference, and everybody's trying to get to at least that target lunch price. But there's a calculator and everything to figure out what these prices have to be at a minimum. And then a school is always welcome to charge more than that, understanding that that may impact their participation. So you will see in some cases a school will charge more than they're required in order to purchase higher quality products, but they are making that judgment call about what their student body can take in terms of that paid lunch price. That also comes into play with adult meal prices. Adult meal prices have to be, can't take into account the paid. We've mentioned before that the federal government does subsidize those paid lunches and there is a paid reimbursement. You don't get those for adult meals. And so the adult meal price is often higher than the student price to account for that. So usually the adult meal price in Vermont is around $5, whereas we might see the student price being around $4 for a lunch. And that updates every year. Now, the second question was around commodities. And I heard you all kind of discussing this a little bit yesterday. So USDA provides those cash reimbursements to schools that we've been talking about for every reimbursable meal served. But they also provide, right now it's about 40 cents per meal, and it doesn't matter the type of meal, it's free, reduced, or paid meal, in the form of USDA foods. So these are actual foods that the federal government purchases to support the meals programs and also to support American agriculture. And so those are often referred to as commodities, or more recently they've been referred to as USDA foods. And those are meant to make up about 20% of the overall support for the school meals programs. So we haven't really been talking about that amount when we're talking about the money that schools are seeing for those programs, but as meal counts increase, we are, in addition, drawing down more federal funding in the form of those USDA foods or commodities. Now, we've long been frustrated in Vermont that even though we're an agricultural state, not a lot of those, or very few of those commodities come from Vermont. And the reason for that is those are purchased in full truckload quantities, like a tractor trailer truckload of one particular product. And we do not have many, if any, producers in the state who are really able to produce on that volume. And so we just don't have really any approved vendors who can even sell to USDA. And we've taken a bunch of initiatives. I've been involved in these programs for 10 years, and over that 10-year period, we've tried to change this. We've had lots of discussions with the Agency of Agriculture, trying to get the largest producers in the state potentially set up to be USDA foods vendors. For a very short period of time, we had a Greek yogurt producer in the southern part of the state who did get set up and was approved to sell to USDA. And so we were purchasing that product. When I say we were purchasing, we were telling USDA we wanted that product, and USDA was turning around and purchasing it. So we were getting it from that vendor, but that vendor ultimately decided that they were having to sell at such a loss in order to get the USDA contract that it wasn't worth their while. And so they had left the program. So that's been pretty frustrating. We really want to bring those USDA dollars to the state. We want to see Vermont products coming through USDA foods. And we've taken a bunch of efforts between AOE and the Agency of Agriculture to try and make that happen. And it's been a real challenge. One way that we have been more successful is that schools do have the option to send some or all of their USDA foods entitlement to the it's called the Department of Defense Fresh Produce Program, DoD Fresh. USDA has a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Defense because the Department of Defense purchases tons of fresh produce for all of their military installations. So DoD is very good at purchasing fresh produce. And so USDA uses that, and DoD goes out to contract with a produce vendor who can distribute to all of our schools. And so right now, the vendor who has that contract in Vermont is Upper Valley Produce. And so they are distributing to Vermont schools who have decided to use their USDA foods dollars in that way. And there's about 30 different fresh produce items in their catalog, and some of those are Vermont products. And that's been the most successful way we've had of directing that USDA foods money to Vermont products. And so schools do have that option. None of that counts in terms of the local foods incentive. We don't count your USDA foods entitlement spending either way. It's not counted towards your overall food spending. And if you do manage to get some local product through DoD Fresh, that's not counted as local product for the purposes of the local foods incentive. We just take that out of the equation entirely when we're looking at the local foods incentive. Some schools, there are certainly foods that you're going to serve in a school meals program. Say, canned peaches are a product that is not readily produced in Vermont. And so some schools have figured out that they're going to divert their USDA foods money to those types of products where they're just not going to be able to get it from a Vermont producer. And that frees up more of that cash reimbursement to spend on Vermont product. And so that's kind of the strategy that we really encourage when folks are really trying to figure out how to maximize their Vermont purchases.
Just wanted some, I guess in my inarticulate way, I'm wondering if you're hearing back from the school food authorities when they're planning meals, if they're like, well, we could do a lot more Vermont product made on Vermont farms, but the meals would cost $8. And so our choice is.
That's the general difficulty that schools have is how do you keep that, how do you balance your budget? How do you keep serving meals under that, using that USDA reimbursement, using the USDA foods, any resources you have, and those are the two resources that all schools have. Some schools do put in a general fund contribution, and so the school food authority, the food service director is using that as well. And you're making a budget and you're figuring out, okay, what are my per plate costs? How much is it going to cost me to serve these meals? And if you pay no attention to your budget and spend $8 per meal, you're going to be turning around and asking your school board for a huge general fund contribution. And, they're not going to be particularly happy about that. And that has, consequences down the line in terms of the school budget. So that is the real challenge. And, our number one priority in these programs are ensuring that students are fed a healthy meal. And then beyond that, we would like to be able to take that money and use it to support Vermont agriculture. But we can't have that come at the expense of serving students healthy meals, particularly those students who are most in need.
So really interesting background. Thank you, Rosie. And I think at least one key takeaway for me related to universal school meals is the piece about the more meals that are served, the larger the commodity allocation from the USDA. So
yeah, that's the same for every meal served to a student. You get the same USDA foods allocation. It doesn't matter whether it's a free, reduced, or paid meal.
I know we've got a couple of other questions, but and we'll come back to it. I have a couple of questions about what those commodities typically are, but Representative Supernaut and then Representative Levitt.
Great, thank you. And apologies if I missed this, but on the local food incentive purchasing, I know a lot of schools have school gardens. Is that included in that percentage if folks are producing a certain amount, and how is that calculated if it is?
Yes. So things that are produced at the school, whether it's from a school garden or maybe there's like some career vocational training. And so there's like baking happening or something like that. That can all be counted. And we ask that a fair market value is assigned and just, a simple like receipt or some kind of documentation to show that. But yes, if there is a robust gardening or some kind of food production happening at the school, that can be included in that.
Thank you.
Representative Levitt?
Oh, I was just wondering, and I think this is for you, Rosie. Do you have the numbers for November yet for the school meals?
So we don't have average daily participation yet, but what we did have, I should have that by tomorrow.
Okay, great.
There's a way that our system doesn't calculate that number until we actually make the payment. So we're making the last payments for November today, and we'll have it tomorrow. But I was able to pull overall participation rates by category for November, and that was information that I provided to JFO. And those participation rates show that free and reduced students are participating at a slightly higher rate compared to their overall percentage of their category than paid students. So that's good news in terms of the pricing or in terms of the cost, because it means that we don't have vastly more paid students participating in proportion to their category. So our original way of doing the estimates, which was to assume that students would participate in proportion to their category, has been fairly accurate. So with that information, we felt fairly comfortable with how JFO was estimating for the rest of this year. But we should have average daily participation for November by tomorrow.
Representative Rice?
Yeah. So two sort of really connected questions, both dealing with the school food authorities that we're missing or that aren't yet participating in these programs. And so the first is like, can you help us understand how one can be at 27% and many can be at, less than 5%? Like what are the things that are in place in that district that many are missing and why, what's standing in the way of getting those things sort of across all districts? And then the other is how, of the districts outside of the 22 that have applied for base year funding, is there anticipation that lots are going to keep doing this? Or or do you feel like there's sort of a cliff that we've reached and there are some that just so far are not showing interest and something needs to be done to sort of like pull them along? Because obviously the goal of all of these programs is to get the percentage of farm to school across the state up to a significant level, and not sort of have this increased stratification between some districts doing really well and some sort of not doing it at all.
Yeah, happy to. I probably won't be able to provide a complete or definitive answer, but some thoughts to both of those questions. Answering the second one first. I think to start with, I'd say all our schools, I think right now are doing the best they can, and there's just severe understaffing happening across the board. And I honestly think that's really probably the largest problem. We've had, not even talking about the local foods incentive, but just getting contracts rebid for food service management companies, which is something that needs to happen, right? It's not would be nice to, if you want a contract, you need to put out a bid. I've had some really tough conversations with really stressed out business offices that are trying to juggle a bunch of different things. And I think that's true across the board. It's incredibly common for food service directors right now to just not have a lot of desk time because they're filling in for vacancies. Either, they're not fully staffed to begin with, or there's folks out sick. And so I think to begin with, I think it's just important to acknowledge, I'm not saying that you weren't acknowledging this, but I think everyone's really doing the best they can. And there's just some real severe shortages kind of across the board in schools, which makes it difficult to then even wrap your head around. If you're not even tracking local and you're probably like at 2% local incidentally, I can't imagine trying to then say, okay, how are we going to shift this entire program around? Beyond that, I do think programs like the Farm to School grant program that the Agency of Agriculture runs, those types of programs do a really good job of starting to instill a culture of farm to school and help kind of bubble up the surface those folks that are interested in it, show some early successes before really trying to shift this program around. Just some other general things. I think some school food authorities view their school meal program as something that should run like a business, and they don't want to invest any money into it other than the federal reimbursement, right? And any loss, right, is considered a loss, and so they're really trying to keep budgets really low, where other schools see it as an investment, right? And it's a program like a science department or a sports program where you're putting money into it and you're seeing results because of it. So to your point, I think we're definitely going to see more school food authorities come on board. Like I said, just attaching that number and being able to compare yourselves to other programs and say they're at 10%, we're at 15%, school down the road's at 25%, why can't we be doing that, is going to go a long way. We're definitely going to get to a point, though, where there are school food authorities where this just like isn't their priority. It hasn't been on their radar. Maybe they just have a really tough budget climate where their budget gets voted down every year. And so it just seems irresponsible to them to be pushing for something like this. So multitude of factors. I think that's my best attempt at an answer there for that second question. Rosie, yeah.
I will also say, the schools that do use a management company, usually those contracts, they run for a maximum of 5 years. And so there are a number of school food authorities that are currently in a contract. Well, I guess they can be renewed for 5 years. So there are folks who are currently in a contract that started before this program was ever on the table. And so Connor has incorporated a lot of language into the new RFP templates for folks going forward that would allow the school food authority to require the management company to track this so that the school food authority could then apply and even to potentially give potential vendors who have more of a plan to increase local to allow them to score higher on the RFP. But for the folks who are currently in a cycle and they don't want to go out to bid just for this reason, I think that there are a lot of folks with management companies who are not currently qualifying for this, who could potentially in the future, once they have a contract that reflects that that's a priority for them.
Yeah. And so then thinking about your first question of just how can you have such a broad spectrum, right? I will say the cohort that did achieve 15% or higher this year, generally speaking, and then especially Windsor Central and Windham Northeast, those two school food authorities that were above 25%. These are programs that are run by food service directors that aren't new, right? They've been doing this for a little while. And they've been prioritizing local far before this program started, right? And so I think it's differences in how food service directors manage their programs, right? And just the kind of level of organization that they bring to that operation. The level of support that their administration and school board has behind them, because again, I don't know, exactly what their finances are, but at least for the Windham Northeast, I'm fairly certain that there's a consistent contribution from their general fund to support this as well. So they're not doing it just purely based on the federal reimbursement. And so I think like any job, like any position, you just have a broad range of how folks approach it. And, with Windham Northeast and Harley, he's, kind of been dedicated from the beginning about sustainability, the environment, local food. He's, partnered for a long time with Food Connects, the food hub down in that region. And they've kind of, that organization and that food program kind of grew together. And they've been really strong partners there. So I think to get 25%, it requires going pretty well above an already demanding job, right? It's difficult to be a food service manager and just meet the minimum, right? To just do the job is stressful and difficult. And so then to then be operating at that high, it's a huge job. And it's incredibly impressive. That's, I would encourage you to look at those numbers and not say necessarily, what's everyone else doing wrong? Again, I don't think that's what you're saying. But it's really like, yeah, what are they doing right? How can we pull those things out and share it with others? I often share Gretchen and Harley's names, those food service directors that are at 25% or higher, with other folks. And they are very generous with their time, thinking about how to kind of turn this into something that's replicable throughout the state. I don't know, Rosie, if you have any additions to that.
No, I think you really captured it. It's a really tough job. And I guess I would say it's usually a really low paid job. We generally do not, as a society, really recognize the amount of labor that those jobs require with adequate compensation. And so these are folks who they really have a passion for the work, and that's why they're doing it. But it is a low paid job. And so we do see intense burnout because of that. And it's funny that Connor's saying that Gretchen and Harley are veteran food service directors, because they are at this point. But I remember when both of them were new, and they were supported by food service directors who had been there for a long time and who taught them what they knew and passed that on. And I think you heard some of the folks yesterday talking about that culture of support among the food service directors in the state, and that's absolutely there. But I have also seen folks come in from restaurants with just as much enthusiasm and excitement and get just burned out by the paperwork, the requirements, and the low pay, and they're gone within the first year. And that's really disheartening. And we do what we can at the agency to keep that from happening and make sure folks feel supported within that first year. But we're not always able to do that because of all these additional pressures.
One other observation that I've just found, both at the agency and then before working at the Agency of Education, I was working at Food Connects, working with food service directors. And kind of a common theme and problem with the position is that there's two really divergent skill sets that you need to be successful, right? And so you need to be passionate about food and cooking and be a chef. And then there's all this reporting and business side and, bureaucratic piece of it. And typically you can find someone that's really passionate about one or the other, right? And so it's either someone that's really good at cooking, they've been, a site manager or something for a long time, or coming from the restaurant industry, and then they're kind of blindsided by all of the bureaucratic piece. Or maybe you have someone that's really good at keeping a balanced budget, right? And it's like keeping the program steady there, but isn't as invested in the food piece. And so it's often hard to find that like magic combination as well of someone that's really drawn to both.
I will say that something that all of these SFAs have in common is that they have a food service director it's kind of unified. That food service director is in charge of the whole program for that whole school food authority. And then they may have site managers at each of the individual sites. And that is not a model that is required. It's a model that we encourage, but we do still have school food authorities in the state where they have a individual manager at every site who is creating their own menu and responsible for all that menu planning and doing their own procurement and filing all the paperwork with us, and also doing the cooking and also doing the dishwashing and serving. And that is just not a sustainable way of doing things when you have all of these requirements. And so again, we really encourage folks to centralize as much as they can with one food service director, and then the site managers can be the ones who are really excited about actually cooking the food, training, food safety, making sure that the kids have a good experience going through the line. And the director is the one who's figuring out kind of a unified purchasing plan, a unified menu, and making sure that folks are not having to kind of reinvent the wheel at every site. But we do, our state is fond of local control. And so sometimes we go into a situation or, a school food authority where we can see at the state level that they're not on a path to success because they are really insisting on making, planning their own menu at every school within the school food authority. And even had one situation where we were just trying to get them to use the same tomato soup recipe. You know, if they used the same tomato soup recipe, then we knew that that recipe credited, they could buy the same ingredients for it, and so they could get together on their purchasing. And the different managers of each site were, well, the kids love my tomato soup recipe. You know, I can't possibly give that one up for this other one. They might not like that. And so that's really a challenge. And, you know, you have to love that kind of local independence, but it also can make it really difficult to be successful in some of these programs. So we definitely see stuff like that happening. And when folks are able to unify, that's when they are more successful at some of these grant programs like the Local Foods Incentive.
Connor, I wanted to just follow up a little bit on Representative Rice's first question. And I think it would be helpful for the committee to have a clear sense, and maybe we can get it from folks from the districts that are scoring very high, or maybe the agency has it. But I think it would be helpful for the committee to know on a product level what it is that is getting some food school authorities to 25%, and whether there's an ability within the state right now to, you know, expand that out to scale. So we heard, for example, yesterday that a lot of beef coming from a particular farm in Memorial County, which was terrific news. And we all know that beef as a protein is expensive, and probably more expensive than alternatives. So I'm just wondering, is that, I mean, if districts just bought a lot of ground beef, would that automatically get them to that point? And if it's not that, you know, what are the other sort of key local products that are getting those districts to those high levels?
Yeah, so one thing that I can do is it's not totally comprehensive, but it might provide a little insight. And so I can share the reporting document that I received from Wyndham Northeast, which just lays out all of their local purchasing, right? It's the document that we use for review, which will provide a little bit of an insight for you into that. And yeah, to the heart of your question, asking like, you know, how do you do this? Because it does kind of feel like a little bit of magic, right? Where you have some schools that aren't coming close. How do you have 27% local? And I don't know if, you know, Harley's already very generous with his time, but I just know when I was at Food Connects, I went and met with Harley, that pretty much asked him the same question of like, how do you make this work, right? Because we were trying to do the same thing regionally of sharing this information with some other school food authorities. And it really comes down to like a budgetary science of kind of looking at your weekly and your monthly menus and figuring out, you know, the thing that stuck with me is that pizza is really cheap, and you can make pizza from scratch, and everyone loves pizza. And so, you know, you can make a lot of money on pizza day because a lot of kids are going to eat pizza. The ingredients are relatively cheap. They can make it from scratch and make it delicious. And then they can roll that money from a cheap pizza day and buy that local ground beef. And so maybe they're actually taking a loss on, you know, the shepherd's pie day or whatever it may be, because they're using that ground beef. And so it's definitely a balancing act within that menu. I'm not sure if I mentioned in this committee yesterday, but we do have a seasonal cycle menu toolkit that the Agency of Education partnered with Vermont Food Service Directors on, that's available on our website, which I encourage you to check out. It's really comprehensive. It provides a 6-week cycle menu for the fall, for the winter, and for the spring. And so those are complete lunch menus for each day of the week for 6 weeks, provides complete recipes for every single thing that's on the menu, and it highlights what those local items are. That wasn't specifically designed for the local foods incentive, and so it's not like there's a guarantee that if you use this menu, you're going to get to 15%. But that's an example of a tool, I think, getting to your point that we have developed to try to help folks that might be starting from the beginning of like, okay, what's a menu even look like? What am I going to be putting on the tray?
Great. Yeah, that's very interesting. I first of all, thank you for offering to send the information that you got from that one particular district. And nice to know about the menu planning service that you offer as well. Yeah, I mean, I do, not to beat a dead horse here, but I do feel that having, a sense of, is the only way to do this to buy a lot of ground beef? And maybe that's way off, but if that in fact is the way to get to 25%, I think just knowing that would be, pretty important. So, Representative Lipsky has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Connor and Jackie. All this information reinforces a lot of your previous testimony and others we've gotten. One thing, one small piece, you highlighting Harley, his trajectory and his professional career prior to becoming a school nutritionist was that he operated his own farm to table restaurant. And he, to your point, he carried a passion and a history of experience into his role as a school nutritionist. And this Jim Birmingham had that same kind of passion. He maybe didn't have that history of connection, but so that was really to Mike, Representative Rice's question. You don't make the, you don't hire that. Those special people make success. But what Representative Cole asked was the most striking to me of this session, and that was about these local committees that some of us heard about for the first time in reading the bill. And it strikes me, we're here as representatives that, among other responsibilities, is to create good policy for the betterment of our state and our specific districts. But that knowledge, Esme, was really, if we know of people in our communities that have this passion or insight or professionalism, how do you want to change the paradigm and the percentages, get some of these people to get appointed to, or you don't run for that committee, but get on those committees. I think as policymakers, I think that's a window that we can help shift this percentage. End of comment.
Something that might be helpful to you in understanding the wellness committees is that the wellness committee has a lot of power in when they write the wellness policy in deciding kind of the general nutrition and food culture environment for the school. So one of the things that they're charged with is figuring out, what's the school's policy going to be on food advertising. And there are some kind of minimum USDA requirements that you can't advertise food that doesn't meet USDA's nutritional requirements, but the committee can go beyond that in the policy. The wellness policy could address things such as the length of mealtime. It could address things such as the foods that are given as rewards, or whether foods can be given as a reward, whether families are encouraged or allowed to send in treats for birthdays and that sort of thing. There's a lot that the wellness committee can establish through the wellness policy in terms of the food culture. Things like a la carte offerings, whether there are going to be vending machines in the school. USDA has some minimum requirements about, again, the nutrition of the foods that can be sold, but the wellness policy can go further than that in restricting those sales. So there is a lot of room there for local control if folks want to make some of those decisions.
Rosie, does this committee answer to the school board, or because it's part of the school food authority or comes under their jurisdiction, is it able to make its own decisions.
Yeah, I think I'd have to go back and I'm not sure what our state policy or the state law says on establishing that committee. I think USDA doesn't say who has to establish it other than the school food authority, that there must be one. And if there isn't one, the school food authority gets penalized. I think that the state law is a little bit more specific about how that's set up and established, and I don't know that off the top of my head. Jess DeCarolis at the Agency of Education has been the one leading the agency's work on school wellness policies, and so she could probably tell you a lot more.
Can you mention that name again?
Jess DeCarolis.
Thank you. Representative Rice.
Rosie, do you have data or information generally on that you could share on the schools that have this centralized director role in place versus schools that are still doing it on a building by building basis?
Yeah, it's not something that so USDA requires that every school food authority designate a food service director for the entire school food authority, but often when we have this kind of situation where where there's not an interest in doing that, the school food authority might designate the business manager as that person, or maybe a manager who is responsible for a couple schools but doesn't actually have responsibility for all of the schools. So every school food authority technically has a director specified. We could certainly, we know all of our school food authorities very well, and we could tell you which ones are. I don't know, we don't have a report that I could pull out of our system. But if you're interested in whether this is happening in your local community, we could certainly have a side conversation and share kind of what we know about specific school food authorities. It's not something that we track kind of at that level.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is that I would be interested in seeing the correlation between if there's when there's somebody in that role who really is doing the role as we desire it to be done, does that correlate to the districts that are having more success in increasing their local food purchasing?
Yes, I think we can definitely say that for sure. And Connor, I believe all the folks who did get the award this year were folks who have a really dedicated food service director.
It's all schools with fairly centralized programs.
And we've even seen some kind of interesting stuff in Addison County. Two school food authorities have actually gotten together to have one food service director across both school food authorities. Kathy Alexander is the food service director there. So that's kind of taking it even to the next level where rather than each supervised union having their own menu, et cetera, they actually share that across two different supervised unions, and that's been quite successful. And Kathy is one of the folks that we direct folks to when they're thinking about whether to move to a centralized model.
Rosie, I think you mentioned at the beginning of our meeting that you might be able to answer or had some answers to questions that came up during the day.
So I've heard you all kind of talking about a couple of different things with regard to the USDA meal pattern that you wish were different. And I wanted to make sure that you know that this week USDA published their proposed rule on meal pattern changes. And this would potentially go into effect for school year 24-25 and beyond. And it's a huge document with a lot of different changes in there. But a few that would be interesting to this committee are that it addresses sugar limits overall, and in particular in milk. And so USDA is looking at a couple of different ways of limiting sugar in milk. One is a cap on added sugar, and one is looking at restricting flavored milk for certain grades or for all students. And that would be restricting flavored milk even with a cap on added sugars. I know you all were also interested in the potential of there being 2% or whole milk allowed in the programs. That's not specifically that would not be allowed under the proposed rule, but this is an opportunity for you all to encourage USDA to do that. So that's one big change. That rule also addresses the Buy American requirements and addresses geographic preference. And these are two things that have an impact on schools' ability to purchase local foods. USDA has had Buy American requirements since I think 1998, which require that schools purchase American product unless that product is not available in sufficient quantities in the US, or unless there's a significant price difference. And this rule addresses what is meant by a significant price difference and makes that a little bit more clear cut. Buy American is something that actually really does impact local food purchasing. We do periodically see things like you all have been talking about cider and juice, and one of the most common products to be purchased that doesn't meet Buy American requirements is apple juice specifically. There's a company that sells a child nutrition sized apple juice, and it is not sourced from the US, but it is a lot less expensive than anything that is available from the US. And so many programs use that using the significant price difference justification. And so, that could be seen as being in competition with Vermont cider or apple juice. So wanted to make you aware of that one. I would imagine that you all would be in favor of strengthening those Buy American requirements for that reason. And then in terms of geographic preference, there are very strict federal requirements around procurement. And you've heard folks allude to that a little bit. But if folks are doing a formal procurement above a certain dollar amount, they have to put out specifications and kind of advertise widely that they are looking to purchase this product. And that's to allow lots of competition. But until now, USDA has never allowed folks to use local as a specification. The geographic preference rule has allowed schools to say that they will give a geographic preference for unprocessed or minimally processed agricultural products that meet their definition of local. But that preference, that means like we're willing to pay a certain percent more, or we're willing to score you a certain percent higher if the product meets the definition of local, but you're still going to consider the prices of products that don't meet the definition of local. And if even after that preference is applied, the local product is more expensive, you can't buy the local product, you have to buy the other product. So these changes to the geographic preference rule would actually allow schools to specifically specify that the product has to be local in order for it to meet those specifications. And if it's not local, you wouldn't consider it. This is only for minimally processed agricultural products. So that's not, not anything that's had additional items added or been cooked or anything like that. But certainly for fruits and vegetables, raw meat products, this is a significant piece that really could make it easier for Vermont schools to be specifying that they want local product and not having to consider lower priced product that's not local. So I would imagine that you all would be interested in sharing your thoughts with USDA about that. It's open for public comment until April 10th. And there's a lot more information about that on USDA's website. They have a whole web page on the specific rule change. So that's one piece I wanted to share. And then you had some really interesting discussion in committee, I think last week, about beverages specifically, and you were asking about 8-ounce packaging for cider and for milk, and whether there's anybody in Vermont who does that. And that kind of sparked some conversation between me and Connor. We do have this a grant from USDA right now that is meant to help us in assisting with the kind of infrastructure around local purchasing. And so we put out a request for information on how we should spend that money, and we've gotten some responses back. And we're kind of about to put out an RFP for contractors who could do that work for us. And we are considering whether to put, based on your conversation, we're considering whether to specifically highlight projects that might expand or create packaging of particularly cider, but also milk in those 8-ounce school sizes. So, and I'm sorry, it's 8 ounces for milk, but 4 ounces is the amount for juice that folks are looking for. So that's a really interesting conversation. And in general, we're always looking for those levers within the existing system. I think I told this committee originally that, the USDA regulations are very, very extensive and often strict. And so we can't just go make all the changes we'd like, but within that system, there are levers that we can pull and little things that we can do to make change happen. And so you've identified there one that I think is a really interesting area. I think you heard from Erica at Harwood that she would be very interested in purchasing a juice product that was in an appropriate child nutrition size, but there isn't anybody there who's currently selling that packed in Vermont. So happy to work with you all more on that. Wanted to let you know that your conversation has kind of sparked some work that we're going to start on that. But I think you're absolutely right to be identifying some of those levers. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention for you all is that in terms of the meal pattern and some of the things that you're discussing, when we talk about the universal meal supplement, assuming that moves forward, that is state funding. And so you all can attach whatever requirements you would like in order for schools to receive that state funding. So we can't put any additional requirements on the federal funding, the federal reimbursement, but you may want to think about whether there are additional things you want to add to that state funding in terms of what your committee is interested in seeing changed. And we're happy to work with you to figure out, are those things reasonable? Certainly we don't want to be in a situation where, we're talking about a school being required to offer universal meals and there's no way that they can get the state funding. And so they're really stuck paying for it locally. But if there are kind of nudges that we can make, we're happy to talk with you about what you're interested in there. Yeah, I think I will leave it at that, but happy to answer any additional questions you all have on that.
Representative Rice.
Connor, so on the milk front, you mentioned that the one that had applied thinking they had reached 15%, but in fact didn't, that it had to do with milk. Can you just explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so milk is specifically excluded from the local foods incentive, and that was included in the legislation. And I wasn't present for those discussions, but I'm fairly positive that the rationale is just that most school food authorities are getting their milk from Hood, and they're unable to, that's not a Vermont product. And so it would just, in the end, hurt their overall, right? It'd be something they had to include. There isn't really a viable alternative. And so it's just making it that much more difficult, especially since milk makes up such a large portion of their budget as a single line item, which is why it's currently excluded. Although I'm sure that does sound strange since we are a dairy state. But that's just the kind of the mechanics of what it would look like. It would ultimately make it that much more difficult for folks to hit 15% with milk included.
That sounds like actually getting to Chair Durfee's question about if is there a specific thing that would help really lift these numbers up? If we could get milk processing and stay in the correct sizes in a way that gets it into schools, that would be something that would have a significant impact on percentage of local purchasing.
And I was in those initial conversations when you all considered this last time. And I think the other factor in there was just the understanding that most of that Hood milk, or a lot of that Hood milk, is coming from Vermont. So it is at least a regional product. And so there wasn't really, again, yeah, there wasn't a local packer, but also that milk wasn't really an area where you needed to encourage folks. People aren't buying milk from Texas, it is going to be regional milk that they're getting. And so you didn't need to shift that as much.
Rosie, thank you for sharing the information about the new rules and the recommendation to reach out to USDA with comment. I think we'll definitely want to talk about that. And yeah, I mean, great news that there's a possibility of having state funding available to help somebody set up a line to bottle 4 ounce apple juice or 8 ounces of milk. That sounds like would make a real difference.
And I don't know that will, like, we have this bit of USDA funding right now. We're thinking we might throw that in as a suggested project for the folks who are doing this work. They have I think that the folks who are out there have other things that they might be interested in doing as well, and we're happy to support that. But yeah, based on that conversation, I think we're happy to try and get a little movement there.
So yesterday, Connor was listening, I think, the entire time, and I'm not sure about you, Rosie, but the witnesses who were here all had one common refrain, which was the request that we support $500,000 for both the farm to school program and for the local purchasing incentive. And I wanted to just clarify with you whether that was a number that the agency or the administration also was supporting.
So I think you may have heard it's not in the governor's budget request, but that doesn't reflect a lack of support from the agency. That was more of an administrative decision that we're, on the program side, we kind of assumed that it was in, and so now we're having those conversations to figure out why. This is the second year that it's been left out, and it seems that there may be something about how the original legislation was written that's kind of confusing us as we create those requests every year and making it seem like it's a one-time request versus something that should be considered kind of in the base. And so we're having some internal conversations about how do we get that clarified, and we will come back to you if there is a legislative change that needs to be made there. But it was not included in the request. So if you want to fund it, that's something you all will need to do.
It occurred to me that I'm not sure that we have actually looked at the legislation that was passed 2 years ago that put this program into place, and it might be helpful to have either Mike O'Grady or somebody else just quickly show us that. I don't know if it was standalone. It probably wasn't standalone. It was probably attached to something else, but.
Yeah, it was part of a larger bill.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Do you remember the act number? Did you have that earlier, Connor?
Act 67.
Act 67. Okay, from last biennium then. Good. Are there any other questions for Connor or Rosie while they're here? And Rosie, I think we will ask. We think that you might want to come back to talk to us about some possible changes to the language in universal school meals regarding independent schools. Is that still?
Yeah, we do have some suggestions for things that would make it a little bit more implementable, areas that we'd like to see clarified so that we understand what you want us to do. But I think it would make sense at this point to come back a different day to do that.
Yeah, good. Well, we'll work that out. And I know you did allude to them when you were here a few weeks back, that there were these small changes, I think. But Representative O'Brien?
I don't know, Rodney, did you ever get answers to your questions yesterday? I mean, along those money lines of context, it's funny we keep talking about 27 or 29 million, but how much is our state, how much does it cost to feed our students in schools?
Well, it comes from a lot of different places. And so it would take me a little while to pull all those places together. I did go back when I heard some of your discussion yesterday, and I was able to very quickly pull in school year. Let's see, no. Yeah. school year 17-18, and I think we probably do have the 19-20 data, but I didn't have it at my fingertips. That year, we pulled down for school meals programs only, we pulled down $22.7 million in federal reimbursement. And then I believe we usually have about $3 or $4 million in USDA foods funding. Connor, is that number sounding right to you? I
I'm
think
really
it's about $4 million,
not sure.
but I can double check that one for you. So that's kind of the federal funding that goes into it. I think, there are other parts of it though. What were the paid families paying? And we don't have a really good way to get that other than to take the number of paid meals served, and we can multiply that by that target price for what they should have been charging. So I haven't done that math, but I could pull that together for you. And then that's making the assumption that what it costs is what we're given. And of course, we do know that some schools do put those general fund contributions in because they end up with a deficit at the end of the year, or because they decide that this is a priority for their school to have more money to purchase higher quality ingredients or what have you. And it's a little harder to pull that information. We do the new financial report that we do now breaks out the general fund contributions, but that's just from this past year when we were doing universal meals under USDA. We don't have that information historically in child nutrition reports. The other place I would look for it is the agency's unified chart of accounts, but that is something that was not historically used in the way that we're using it now. And so if we're trying to go back and look at what things looked like in the 18-19 school year, I can certainly ask those questions, but we may not get you as perfect a number as you're looking for.
Before the pandemic, before universal school meals, what was the state share? So like this 27 million would be, on top of that essentially. Do we know what the sort of state share of feeding all the school kids in Vermont was?
So before the pandemic, we were paying for the reduced price student share, but the state wasn't paying, the state was not providing any contribution for paid meals. And so for the for the reduced price share, we that year, let's see, we paid just over $265,000 for reduced price lunch, and for breakfast, just over $115,000. So in general, the appropriation for that has been less than $500,000 for both breakfast and lunch, and that's just paying for, again, that student reduced price share. That number is going to go down this year because you have more schools doing CEP, and in CEP there is no reduced price share.
And that came out of the general fund?
Yes, that came out of the general fund. And then we had some state funds going towards those equipment grants that Connor was telling you about. And then we also are required by USDA to pay out a certain amount in what's called state match. And this is a fixed amount of money that we're required to pay. A couple of years ago, you did increase that because this is a very easy way. If you just want to get cash into school meals programs and you don't want to attach any additional strings, increasing the state match amount is a very easy, non-administratively burdensome way to do that. So we get, looks like we did that year state match for, doesn't sound right to me. I have 132,000 on my list, but I think it's more like 300,000. This is an amount that's required by USDA that the state put towards child nutrition programs. We take that total dollar amount and we take the number of meals schools serve between July and December every year, and we divide that total amount by those meals served, and then we allocate it out to the schools. So I think that year it may have been like 11 cents per lunch served that schools ended up getting, and an additional few cents per breakfast served that schools ended up getting. So if you increase that state match amount, then that just increases the pot that's divided among all the schools. It's a one-time payment that we make in the spring, again, based on the total number of meals served. So going forward with universal meals, when we're serving more meals, if that state match amount stays the same, the per meal amount is going to be lower, just because that dollar amount is going to be divided among more meals. Does that answer what you were looking for there?
I think so. I mean, it was interesting that it was such a little amount before, relatively to Vermont.
Yeah, no, and sometimes we'll hear folks say that, well, we're going to save all that money that we used to spend, but we didn't used to spend a lot of state funds this way.
Yeah, I think that's the first time we've heard even sort of the like magnitude number of that amount that we were spending on the reduced. So that's good to have. Any other questions? So thank you both for coming in on short notice, and Connor, really appreciate all the insight that you provided. I'm thinking that we may be in pretty good shape as a committee on sort of understanding the nuts and bolts of the local food program, other than I think maybe we'll take a look at the actual language that exists and need to figure out going forward what the mechanism is for an appropriation. Glad to hear you're working on updating the RFP for the coming year, so that's good to know. And possibly, if it's all right, Connor, I'm thinking maybe if there are individual members of the committee who would like to keep working on possibly some changes to the program, that they might reach out to you directly, rather than have you come back in front of the committee. I don't know if you're okay with us working that way, but just to move things along a little bit.
We'll just loop our legislative affairs staff in, but I think that should be fine.
Yeah. Okay, good. And then we'll reach out also to connect to have you and Rosie sometime next week, if that works for you, just to talk about the other things that we wanted to hear from you on regarding the universal school meals.
Great.
That sounds good. I will, so I'm going to send along both that report from Wyndham Northeast on their purchasing for folks interested in looking at that. You'd also asked about what USDA foods are offered. And so I'm going to send along the purchasing worksheet that we send to schools, which is just a simple one-page document that provides an overview of what items we offer. And Vermont offers from USDA about 30 items that schools could order to just give you a sense of what is in that catalog.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks again, and have a good rest of your day.
You as well. Bye.
And committee, any thoughts before we adjourn?
The state reimbursement, did I miss something, or is that new? I feel like that's the first time I've heard about that.
State match?
State match. Are they calling it?
That's the first time. Well, I wrote it down because I wasn't sure whether it was something we already had talked about, or it sounds like it's not something.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad, because I was like, I have not heard about this before.
You mean for the entire program, we also contribute money? Isn't that what we're budgeting, the 29 million?
Yeah, no, this is something else, I think.
Matching the.
Yeah, but I'm not sure. So
okay.
There's lots of things that are new, obviously, to all of us, and digging into now. So.
Very deep.
I just have a clarifying point, and I'm happy to.
Would you like to come up to the? Good morning.
Good morning, Meg Fost from the Wetco Action Circles. I just want to I'm not sure if this came across clearly, but I do want to clarify for the committee that the farm to school grant program is level funded in the governor's FY24 budget. It's just the local purchasing incentive that is not.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that.
And is the local, is it everybody's understanding that the local incentive is purely a Vermont thing, or is it mandated by the federal? No, it's purely Vermont
Yeah, I don't think there's any federal
mandate.
things at all there, yeah. So, yeah, see if we maybe have, Legis Council show us quickly the language. If we want to continue doing that, it sounds like we may need to, put it in the bill.
Right.
Great, all right, well. I think we'll stop there then, and we're gonna try and schedule. We don't have anything on our agenda until 2, but please come back at 1. We'll either have Ledge Council walk us through, or have some other things to talk about.